It is an honor and a joy to have here today. Will you please join me in welcoming Bishop Katharine Jefferts Schori.
Thank you. It's a great joy to be here and to see Mike and other old friends, Susan and many others. I first met your rector around the year 2000 when we were talking about 0.7%. Do you remember that? The percentage of income across the nations that would be needed to end the worst of the world's poverty. That evolved into Millennium Development Goals and then into Sustainable Development Goals. And together, we have reduced the worst of the world's poverty by more than half. By more than half. There's still a long way to go, but we have made amazing progress. Can you hear? Oh, I can. Maybe the hearing is better in another part of the room because this feels very loud to me. Can someone offer suggestion about where you might hear better in this room?
I need to see your face.
Okay. Well, it's.
So I'll just make you.
Well, all right. I don't want you to miss. I'm gonna start by asking you to think a little bit about why you are here. Ultimately, this morning, I want to get us involved in deeper interpersonal conversation. So let me invite you to spend a moment reflecting on what it is you value, what it is that moves you in the natural world. What do you love and value about creation? In a minute. I'm going to give you an example, and then I'm going to ask you to turn to somebody near you and share with each other. I'm Katharine. Introduce yourself. I continue to be amazed at the diversity and beauty of creation. The kinds of plants that grow in this Mediterranean climate. The rich diversity of creatures in the seas off this coast, and the subtle beauty of the deserts east of here. Now, take a couple of minutes and share with your neighbor what you love and value about creation. There's a whole lot of passion in this room. And I think that's essential. We have to recognize that it's not heads that make changes, it's hearts that cause changes. Transformation comes from deep within us. We can know the right thing and not do it. The motivation to do it comes from compassion and passion. Okay, I'm going to start this part by quoting scripture, American scripture. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Many of you will recognize Robert Frost's Fire and Ice, published almost a century ago. The lore says that it was inspired by Frost's encounter with a famous Harvard astronomer, Howard Shapley. When the poet asked him how the world would end, Shapley reportedly said, that either the Earth would be incinerated or a permanent ice age would gradually annihilate all life on Earth. Cosmologists and astronomers are still wrestling with the ultimate fate of the universe. Will it keep expanding and dissipating energy, ending in a big freeze? Or will it eventually cease expanding and contract into a cosmic inferno, a big crunch, possibly followed by another Big Bang? Almost a century before Shapley met Frost, scientists began to understand that the atmosphere acts like a thermal blanket. And in 1856, Eunice Foote showed that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases those effects. Her results were reported in a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, but her gender prevented her from either presenting or publishing her own paper. For a century and a half, credit was given to John Tyndall, who published 3 years after she did. In 1896, Svante Arrhenius made the first calculations about the effects of carbon dioxide on the atmosphere, predicting an ice age if the concentration were halved, and an increase of 5 to 6 degrees centigrade if the concentration were doubled. We have known quite a lot about the consequences of adding carbon to the atmosphere, and we have known it for quite a long time. If you look at a graph of the average global temperature over the last 1,000 years, you see a fairly stable range of temperatures with a slight cooling trend, a few tenths of a degree centigrade, until about the year 1900. The turn of the last century brought a rapidly rising trend. More recently, the global temperature has risen over 1 degree centigrade, and 16 of the hottest 17 years on record, over half a degree centigrade, have occurred since the year 2000, and the year 2016 is the last full year of data. The 17th was 1998. To put this in a longer historical context, the global carbon dioxide levels over the last 500,000 years, that's the time span on this graph, have ranged between 180 and 300 parts per million in the atmosphere. We began to see a precipitous rise in the 1950s, with a high last August of 407 parts per million. These are the last 12 years, steady up. Fire and ice? No, fire. We are quickly driving this planet toward heat death. The wildfires and hurricanes of this last season, from Harvey to Mariah, are witness to the increased energy in the atmosphere and ocean. In other words, heat, which together with a greater water-holding capacity of a warmer atmosphere mean increasingly violent storms and flooding. The lessons that we learned in 2005 from Katrina, Rita, and Wilma meant that this year's preparatory effects brought much lower loss of life. Yet similarly violent storms in Asia this past summer killed more than 1,000 and displaced some 16 million people. Wealthier communities and nations can mitigate some of these changes. Poorer ones are largely at the mercy of the winds and the waters. I can remember Archbishop Michael Baroy from Pakistan speaking to the House of Bishops in about 2003 about the flooding on the coastal plains, and he said over and over again, "Save us from these curses." Even the recovery process discriminates. Many of the people who evacuated before Harvey and Irma have been evicted, and not just because of flooding. Others are being told they cannot rebuild. Puerto Rico has stewed for weeks on end, even though Texas and Florida got pretty immediate federal help. We saw the same realities after Katrina, and they are unfolding on the mainland and in the Caribbean. It's not just our human neighbors who are affected by fire in the atmosphere and flood on the ground. The entire planetary system is shifting away from a dynamic equilibrium. Heat is melting polar ice, making the Northwest Passage into a new tourist route. No joke. Collapsing ice shelves in the Antarctic and the melting Greenland ice sheet are raising sea level and causing sunny day flooding, i.e. when there is no storm at hand, along our coasts. Miami and other low-lying coastal cities will be gone by the year 2100 if we don't stop the flood tide of greenhouse gases. This is Manhattan if the sea level rose a mere 10 feet. Growing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are dissolving in the oceans, shifting the pH, the acidity measure, and making it harder for corals and plankton to build their skeletons. These are pteropods. They are prime food source for Pacific salmon, among other creatures. And their disappearance means less food, and the shifting pH of the ocean means less shelter for other sea life, including fish. 3/4 of the world's fish stocks are already overfished. Changing climate is expanding deserts as well as shifting rainfall patterns, and stable crops are threatened in many regions. The world is likely to need 70% more food by the year 2050, even if the population stops growing at just under 10 billion people. The rising expectations of developing societies are raising the demand for meat. Staple grain crop production has been 3 to 5% below expectations for almost 40 years due to increasing temperatures. And harvests of those stable crops in Africa are expected to decline by 10 to 20% or more. Climate shifts affect everyone, even though the effects hit the poor hardest. Some of you know about the disastrous heat wave in French vineyards last August. Not good for the vintage, let alone the lives and livelihoods of the vintners. The locals called the heat wave Lucifer. Napa Valley hit 117 degrees over Labor Day weekend. And where wine grapes didn't turn into raisins, harvests were significantly smaller. Last month, a number of those vineyards literally burned up. Global warming is the result of heat-generating greenhouse gases. While carbon dioxide is the biggest source of those, methane and nitrous oxide and several other greenhouse gases are significant, and they have a larger impact by volume than carbon dioxide does. Methane primarily comes from agriculture and as a byproduct of oil and gas production. It's still being flared off oil wells and gas wells rather than being captured and used. Nitrous oxide mostly comes from agriculture and land use practices. Halocarbons are mostly refrigerants. They're a particularly potent source of greenhouse gas effects. You will remember that the world banned Freon in 1989 because of a shrinking ozone layer. But the second and third generation refrigerants that followed Freon are extremely potent greenhouse gases. They persist in the atmosphere for a very long time, up to 50,000 years, compared to about a century for carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, and a decade for methane. And those refrigerants aren't usually recovered when cooling systems fail or are retired. They're simply off-gassed into the atmosphere. There is some good news. The United States and the world's other nations did sign an agreement in Kigali in Rwanda last year to drastically reduce the production and use of these new kinds of refrigerants. There are green refrigerants that do not cause these problems in the atmosphere, but scaling up to use them and ensuring that they're used in all kinds of refrigeration equipment is going to take a while. Extraction of fossil fuels and their use for electricity and transportation contribute about half of the greenhouse gas burden. Agriculture and land use make another quarter of the total. Buildings, both residential and commercial, amount to another 10%, and the rest comes from industrial processes, making things like steel and plastics and chemicals, and from waste and waste management. This is a very short tour through the hospital ward that is our planet. Our world and all its inhabitants are suffering, and the prognosis is poor, for the patient is at the mercy of its human colonists, or some might say parasites. When God set Adam and Eve in the garden and told them to tend and till it, their labor was meant for the flourishing of the entire garden and not themselves alone. We have been ignoring and denying our vocation, and the mess is growing. What does it mean to love our neighbors in the midst of a planetary crisis? The planet is going where it has never gone before, with a heat and greenhouse gas load never seen by living creatures. We're not going boldly where no one's gone before, more like arrogantly, thinking ourselves the masters of creation rather than its partners. The faith journey that we are on has a good deal to say about our destination and how we travel. The prime directive is love. Love the one who created us. Love all that is. We're meant to love all of it, without exception. Not easy, but essential. This planet has bounds and limits, like the Garden of Genesis, and like the boundary markers that God ordered the Israelites to set up in the Promised Land, this far and no farther. Those limits are not a wall to keep some in and some out. They mark a container for creativity. We're called to tend this ground, love these people, care for this patch of life. When we garden well, the benefits bless all our neighbors around the globe. Do you remember or know about the feast of Rogation Tide? In England, it's still common in rural areas to have a procession around the boundaries of the parish, and in England, a parish is a geographic area. And as this procession goes, people are meant to notice and give thanks and bless what is discovered within the bounds of the parish. That's loving the neighbors in field and forest, river and mountain, house and stable. The old term for doing that is beating the bounds, and it's a kind of holy accounting for the well-being of all creatures and the land and waters that nourish and support them. We need to recover a sense of place like that, even as the world becomes more and more urbanized. Urban centers are far more efficient in terms of carbon, but they're not necessarily the best places to teach about the ecosystems that nourish all life, and the land and air and waters from which our food is sourced. We have to be intentional about sharing the value of wilder places through gifts like the Camp Stevens that both our dioceses share. How many urbanites know something of wilderness and its ability to lower blood pressure and promote human healing? Because it is about that kind of rest and Sabbath that Mike spoke of. When people begin to see how they can help to mitigate the consequences of climate change, like storm surge and flooding, perhaps we will begin to bless the wild places around us. What happens at the end of the worship service that's probably most familiar to people in this room? The deacon, if there is a deacon, stands up and says, "Get out." Right? We are dismissed at the end of the Mass, which is about mission and sending. We are sent out into the world to engage the world outside ourselves and outside our comfortable communities, to meet all our neighbors, and together to begin to heal the breaches and the brokenness. That's the way of Christ. The limits in the garden, God asking the earth creature, Adam, "Where are you? Where are you?" I think the same is asked of us. Where are we in terms of caring for our garden? Limits and boundaries are part of holy living, for they help us to remember that we are not the center of existence around which the world turns. If we want to find the abundant life that Jesus promises, we in some sense have to get out of our own way, especially our self-centered ways. If we're going to love our neighbors equally, with equity, we have to help the community discover the creative possibility of limits. In some sense, our task is to rediscover the art of hospitality, to learn to entertain strangers, to bless travelers, to welcome neighbors. We certainly have a guide in Jesus who walked up to people and said, "I'd like to have dinner at your house tonight." Especially people who weren't welcome in polite society. He engaged wind and water creatively. He sought more abundant life among the dead and the destitute and the desperate. Our lives ultimately depend upon the rich interconnected web of carbon cycling bacteria, plants and fungi, the water that cycled through atmosphere and ocean, and the healing powers of things like willow, from which we get aspirin, molds, penicillin, other antibiotics, the yew tree, cancer toxins, and parts of creation that are still unknown to us. Our task is about remembering, in both senses of calling to mind and putting back together, our goodly heritage, recovering habits of awe and conservation, and finding our ultimate worth as creatures, all creatures of the same God. The work that is most needed to avert and heal our current planetary crisis is spiritual work. Acknowledging that we are not the creators and that our interconnectedness, our willingness to love neighbors, is essential to health and holiness and healing. And all those words come from the same root. How? Practicing our faith in thanksgiving, returning to the way, having gratitude for what is. As St. Francis said, brother sun and sister moon. And what the Lakota call mitakwe oyasin, all our relatives. All our relatives. How do you practice thankfulness? How do you bless the food you eat and the air you breathe and all the other creatures and created systems that make both possible? When we begin to notice the grand variety of our relatives, we are seeing the face of God. Gratitude begets awe, and awe begets careful behavior. Humility. The word comes from humus. Remember that you are dust, made of earth or humus, and that to dust and earth we shall return. We are part of earth, and we are part of the stardust that makes up all our relatives. Will we love them as ourselves? Can we begin to shift our focus from self-assertion and self-expression to making room for that property in all lives? It's a tall order in the West. But even if we look at our history in this part of the world, we might remember a frontier ethic that said, there's room for you if you don't pollute the water hole. We don't have another river or lake or aquifer. We don't have another planet. Yet we can all thrive if we are willing to note the limits and boundaries to our existence. Enough. Jesus told a parable about a man who wanted to build bigger barns to store his stuff, but discovered he was going to die that night. It's our story. Look at the storage facilities around us. They're like mushrooms. We can learn to live with less. And we can learn to live a life that's not focused on consumption. Our grandparents used to call consumption the wasting disease. And even though they meant tuberculosis, the consumptive plague has infected our generations. Be mindful of what you buy. Plan for sustainability rather than the latest fad. Some people are intentional about if they bring one new thing into the house, they take out 2 others. Lent is a good time for spring cleaning, not just of the heart, but of the house. You can invoke the Jewish practice of getting all the leaven out of the house. What has grown and mushroomed here over the last year? We are bumping up against the limits of what this planet can support. Will we be instruments of our own destruction or instruments of the healing of the whole? Creativity. Necessity is the mother of invention, and a vacuum does invite filling. The first photovoltaic panel was invented at Bell Labs the year I was born, and it produced electricity at a cost of $1,900 a watt. Today's panels produce electricity at about 65 cents a watt, and the price keeps coming down. Collaborative groups are working to develop those refrigerants that don't cause atmospheric warming, as well as how to safely recycle the existing halocarbons that do. Practical theorists, then that's not an oxymoron, are gathering data and making projections about how to best counter the looming planetary fireball. And I'm going to come back to that at the end. To be made in the image of God is to be creative. And we are seeing immensely hopeful scenarios that can call us to concrete action. Last spring, a group of visionaries published a plausible vision of how to reduce the greenhouse gas inputs that are expected by 2050. Their work is summarized in a website and a book called Drawdown. It's edited by Paul Hawken with the assistance of Tom Steyer, whose name you might be more likely to recognize. It offers 80 game-changing ways to limit the temperature increase on this planet by beginning to shift the curve downward. The turning and returning, and I'm implying our tradition of confession and amendment of life, of returning to God, the ancient Hebrew call to come back to God, to come home. Turning the curve downward to lower the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. These strategies are already being implemented to some degree. The challenge is to scale them up enough to shift the direction of carbon flow out of the atmosphere. The top 10 solutions account for about half of the total that's represented by all 80. Some are familiar. Others will surprise you. We can be involved in most of these in our own households, congregations, and cities. Those refrigerants I talked about. Most of them are more powerful greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide. The world's nations agreed to stop using Freon, and that agreement has been phenomenally successful. The ozone hole is healing. If we can replace those new refrigerants with green compounds and recover most of them before they enter the atmosphere, we can remove the equivalent of almost 100 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Locally, what does that mean? It means repair your refrigeration units in your cars and refrigerators, your air conditioners, your HVAC systems. You can replace them with greener compounds and more efficient systems. We can re-engineer them to use different refrigerants. The second one is to increase the use of wind-produced electricity from about 3 or 4%, which it is today, to 22% by 2050. Wind turbines. California has a lot of wind turbines. When I've been in England in the last 10 or 15 years, particularly in London, I see these houseboats, each of which has a little tiny wind turbine on the back to make enough electricity to run the lights on the houseboat. Small-scale wind turbines can make a difference as well, as can or could networked community systems. You can also buy electricity that's produced by wind. Reducing food waste. This is the third most significant thing we could do. Food waste amounts for 8% of global emissions. Reducing it would also reduce deforestation and increase carbon sequestration, the storage of carbon in the soil, as well as trees, and decrease the total burden by about 70 gigatons. In the United States, we waste 1/3 of the food we produce. 1/3. What can we do locally? We can rescue food, collect it from grocery stores and restaurants where it has passed perhaps the use-by date, sell-by date, or excess has been produced. We can buy ugly produce. There is a very creative chef who is going around the country preparing feasts for the communities and collecting all of the food that is used in that feast that basically has been discarded, either because it's crooked potatoes or blemished fruit. It's perfectly good to eat, but the average consumer will not buy it in the grocery store, so it goes to waste. We can also encourage our suppliers not to waste food. We can change our buying habits in creative ways. Eat more plants. Eating a healthier diet, both more moderate caloric intake and more plant-based content, would yield 66 gigatons less carbon in the atmosphere. It's a challenge not only to developed nations like ours that have a more meat-based diet and who generate 20% of emissions from those meat-based diets, but it's also a looming challenge for developing nations whose growing populations aspire to a similar menu. If cattle were a nation, they would be the third largest generator of greenhouse gases. Shifting to a vegan diet reduces emissions by 70%. Shifting to a vegetarian diet, i.e. you eat eggs and dairy products, reduces it by 63%. A side benefit of doing this would be a $1 trillion annual healthcare savings. Restore tropical forests. Improve their soils, replant trees. That significantly increases their carbon storage capacity. Before the Industrial Revolution, tropical forests covered about 12% of the planet's land mass. Today it's only 5%, and it is decreasing daily. Educate girls. It makes an enormous difference to economies and nations. It also reduces population growth rates. Together with providing family planning services to everyone who wants them, these two solutions would produce another 60 gigaton reduction for each of them. Locally, what do? We insist on and support education and health services for more than half of humanity. If you remember the Millennium Development Goals and you have learned about the Sustainable Development Goals, educating girls and women and providing maternal health services and family planning health services are central to those goals. Communities thrive when women have decision-making capacity throughout their lives, and educating them is a central way to get there. More solar farms, particularly community access to solar when an individual housing unit doesn't have an appropriately directed space to put a panel on, changing local regulations about where to put them and how people can get access to them. If solar farms' contributions to electrical generation grew from 0.4% where they are today to 10%, we'd gain 37 gigatons of carbon offset. Silvopasture basically means mixed farming practices. It means raising crops and running livestock on land that is planted to a variety of plants and trees. It's a diverse ecosystem is healthier and more productive than a monoculture, and more carbon is stored in the soil and the plants that live there. And again, it would take shifting local regulations and land use planning. There's a city in Maryland that has decreed that it wants to become filled with plants that it might be a food forest. A food forest. I sat in a restaurant, a street-side restaurant on Tuesday for lunch and looked at the zucchini that was growing in November in a planter outside that restaurant. We live in a part of the world here where food crops, the oranges near my apartment are getting ripe, and they're wonderful. We can landscape with food plants, and we don't often think that way. There is an enormous movement across faith communities in this country toward planting gardens, to taking out their lawns and making that land productive of food. Not only does it feed people, it improves the atmospheric conditions on the earth for everybody. Okay. Green roofs go the same direction. Rooftop solar, moving again from 0.4% to 7% of total electricity generation, makes another big reduction. The Diocese of California a year or two ago challenged all its congregations to install rooftop solar, and they're close to having accomplished that. I commend it. It's happening not by directive in San Diego, but there are 3 at the moment who are in the process of installing or turning on their solar systems. Panels are being installed all over the world, including, let me just show you that those top 10 account for half of the total that they have dreamed up, that they believe are possible. Panels are being installed everywhere, including on the homes of indigenous peoples living on floating islands in Lake Titicaca. You want to power your cell phone? This is another example of how we're going to jump a layer of development that the West has practiced. There aren't any landlines for telephones in much of the developing world. They have gone straight to cell phones. And there's no reason why we need the kinds of electrical distribution systems everywhere in the world. We can go to locally produced sustainable power. I share this scenario to show that it's possible to change the future of this planet, to turn it toward renewed health, and away from a route toward widespread death. We have to begin with confession, truth-telling about the sad state of the planet, and proceed to amending our lives together. We can make an enormous difference if we work together. Now, I want to prompt some discussion, and we can either... Are there any questions about any of this before we move in that direction? Yeah. You can't hear everything? Is that what you said? Okay. Do we have a couple other runners? Because there are two more mics. Great. Thank you.
I understand everything that you're saying, and I agree 100% with everything that you're saying. But look at the people that are here. It's the same people that come every time. They're all in my age group or older. I want to know how we're going to get young people more into this. I mean, I have great-grandchildren, and they're like me, and they recycle and do everything because I trained them that way. But how do you get other people engaged when it's the same people all the time? And we're not going to be here that much longer.
You'd be surprised. If you make it to 60, you're likely to live another 25 years. If you make it to 70, you're likely to live another 15 or 20 years. The gift of people your age is that you have time and the ability to speak and network and motivate other people. People who are working like slaves don't have as much time. The gift is that schools are often now teaching our children, as well as their grandmothers, about how we can make a difference at the local level. But the gift of your position in life is a gift that can be used in this way. So go out there and preach the good news, please. Other questions, thoughts? Mike?
Actually, a rather technical question about solar roofs, which is, as I've participated in this conversation in a couple different congregations, one of the arguments against it has been, well, the technology is developing so quickly that by the time we pay all this money to put on the solar roof, a more efficient solar roof will have been generated, and which would have been better. But at the same time, how would you answer that sort of, like, where's the delta where it becomes a good thing to do it? And I'm hoping we've already reached that place.
It's a good thing to do because we can save energy now. And we have begun to act in ways that are not simply about maximizing profit. We're thinking large scale, we're thinking about externalities. And if there's a better system 20 years down the road when this one's worn out, wonderful. You know, you can buy solar roof tiles now. They're first generation, Tesla's making them. It's another route. It may prove more effective, it may not, but it will be a great experiment to see, thousands of people try them. Yeah.
Tesla came out with an all-electric truck now, like
Yep.
an 18-wheeler.
Yep.
So hopefully that will make a big difference if we can get away from diesel.
Absolutely, and self-driving trucks are likely to make a big difference, although the gurus at this point think that the main advantage of those is going to be between cities. It's the local part where they're going to need human actors. Mm-hmm. Please.
Yes.
It's on.
Every time I'm in a community where we talk about some changes, another part of the community steps up and says, that's going to take away jobs. How do we handle that jobs issue?
It has been ever thus, hasn't it? Farmers, look at how farming has changed. Look at how writing has changed. We don't do a whole lot of manufacturing of these things anymore. Communication has changed. New jobs are created. I think one of the challenges in this country is that we have not invested in our educational system adequately, and we are not training people for the technical jobs that are emerging. We have not done a good job of that. We have undereducated labor force in many ways. That's one reason why so many graduate students come from overseas and stay. Yes, we are blessing the whole world, but we should be blessing this land as well. Educational systems are often better in other parts of the world. And again, it's if you want to be a devil's advocate, you might say that the system is rigged to produce instruments of labor, commodified labor, who is only qualified to do certain kinds of work, and that at times it's been intentional. Please.
This is another technical question. One of your slides regarding polar caps and how it melted and it's created a new cruise route. This is about salinity. Now, with all of the ice breaking off, does that affect the salinity of the ocean? And if so, could that contribute to climate change, or does it contribute to fish populations, or what exactly?
It's a wonderful question. Yes, the melting of large quantities of ice will make the ocean fresher. The big question is how it's likely to change current patterns, because they impact the global weather. And I don't think we know that yet. There are undoubtedly some scenarios out there that I haven't explored, but significant shifts in salinity cause changes in how the water is overturned. You know how we get upwelling off this coast in the late summer and early fall most years? When the current along this coast comes south from Alaska, and because of the Coriolis effect, it pushes the surface water offshore, and deep water that's more fertile comes upwells from underneath. It's colder, it's full of nutrients. Changes in surface salinity can cause the same kinds of realities of overturning. They may bring anoxic, deoxygenated water to the surface. You've heard of dead zones, overproduction, particularly from fertilizer output, like out of the Chesapeake Bay or out of the Mississippi River. There are large dead zones at lower depths off of those coasts because the fertilizer prompted a lot of plant growth, which deteriorated and used up the oxygen when it rotted. Salinity can cause similar kinds of change, can cause that water to overturn, changes in salinity. We don't know yet about that, but yes, it's a big question. Very important question, long term.
I had a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
You didn't mention transportation. Didn't make the top 10, but in Los Angeles, that's a big part of our life, is getting from A to B. And if you would comment on it, please.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me that these are plans for shifting it. California's already doing a whole lot in terms of fuel economy and shifting to renewables. Europe, many of the countries in Europe are likely to basically ban non-electric vehicles by 2040. And California should be the beneficiary of programs like that, legislation like that. I don't know what's happening with the hyperlink, the ultra-high-speed train link. Is that still on the books? Of course it's controversial. Yeah, okay, but it's still in the works. We're thinking about ways to improve mass transit. You know, driving up here this morning, I was reminded at simply how many cars there are in California, and how few of them have more than one person in them. We are producing, you know, smaller vehicles that are more like personal vehicles, which take less energy to run and can be plugged in at night. I think we're going to see electrification of the transportation fleet pretty quickly. In a geography the size of the West Coast, mass transit's hard. It's really hard. It makes sense in dense cities, but it's tough for getting from San Diego to San Francisco, unless we're going to build like bullet trains, TGVs, train en vitesse. Yes, okay.
One thing that I'm surprised isn't on the list is adjust the thermostat. I noticed 20 minutes ago, cold air started blowing on me, and I'm sitting here with my sweater on, kind of shivering.
Okay.
We could all adjust the thermostat and have more temperature tolerance for a little bit warm, a little bit cool.
Absolutely. Earlier on in one of the slides, I showed how much came from buildings. HVAC, you know, heating and ventilation and air conditioning in buildings is a piece of that, but it's also the concrete from which we build buildings. Buildings have to have ventilation or they're unhealthy. So part of it is figuring out how to do that with natural airflow. It's complex, and buildings built in the 70s aren't always the most efficient at that. Please.
I rent. How can I convince my landlord to put up some solar panels or to change up my air conditioner? I think I'll have to pay for the refrigerator.
How to put on solar panels or
on my roof? On my roof.
Ask.
I
Get your
can
neighbors.
ask. He doesn't even want to pay for minor repairs.
Well, get your neighbors together and lobby. You know, go to the city council. You know, I'm sure get some solidarity going. And if you can't do that, perhaps there's a community solar array that you could connect to.
So it's interesting because my question was going to be that given that in Southern Cal, when you put up solar panels, it's equivalent to a 15% annual rate of return on that investment.
50?
15, which is much better than you get from banks because the payback's in about 6 or 7 years. Mm-hmm. So my question was going to be, why wouldn't everyone in Southern Cal put up solar panels? It's an incredible investment, better than getting 1 or 2% in the bank. It's just strange that people don't instantly do that and transfer their money.
Think about how we started this conversation. The poor do not always have access to capital. That is something that community organizations are doing in some places, providing the capital to install solar systems, to make community solar arrays available that are far less costly to the individual. It's thinking in a different way. And yes, why don't we put solar on every dwelling unit in Southern California? We could.
Well, thank you all. It's been a very stimulating conversation, and thanks again to the Bishop. And we're going to take a little break now, and then you're going to come back and do a little work yourselves.